And shall we do something together tonight? Play poker? Well, all right, but I better remind you that the last time we played, you lost your tiny little shirt because I had that full house and oh, hello! I'll talk to you later. When I was in second grade, well, our teacher got married and moved away. And we got a new one, and her name was Miss Holloway. And when she walked into the classroom, well, we couldn't believe our eyes. She was only 2 feet tall. She had blonde hair and blue eyes and looked like a doll. Well, everyone thought that this was hilarious. And when Miss Holloway told us to get out our books to study, well, we just laughed. Why should we? Said Jeremy Laramie. We're bigger than you, and we can do whatever we want. But much to our surprise, Miss Holloway just smiled calmly and said, as you wish. I get paid the same whether I teach you or not. And then she pulled out a portable TV, turned on The Price is Right, and started knitting a rug. Well, of course, everyone was thrilled. And every day we came to class and laughed and played while Miss Holloway quietly knitted and watched TV. And every day before we went home, she'd say the same thing. Good night, sleep tight, you just wasted one more day of your life. Well, this went on for 4 weeks. And every day, the last thing we heard was, good night, sleep tight, you just wasted one more day of your life. Well, finally we started to think that, maybe it wasn't the brightest idea to give up our education just because our teacher looked like a doll. So we swallowed our pride and we asked Miss Holloway if she would please start teaching us. Okay, she said, as soon as I finish my rug. Well, little Miss Holloway turned out to be the best teacher we ever had. We learned new and wonderful things every single day. And every single day before we left, she'd say, good night, sleep tight, let this new knowledge be your guiding light. Miss Holloway taught school for many more years until she got an offer to be a runway model for American Girl. Oh, and she also got married to a handsome fireman who was almost 7 feet tall, and somehow or another they managed to have 9 kids. But as they say, that is another story. Now, this is one of the very first and very best stories about a tiny little girl and her incredible adventure. It's Thumbelina by Hans Christian Andersen. Here was once a woman who wished very much to have a little child, but she could not obtain her wish. At last she went to a fairy and said, I should so very much like to have a little child. Can you tell me where I can find one? Oh, that can be easily managed, said the fairy. Here is a barley corn of a different kind to those which grow in the farmer's fields, and which the chickens eat. So put it in a flower pot and see what will happen. Thank you, said the woman, and she gave the fairy 12 shillings, which was the price of barley corn. Then she went home and planted it, and immediately there grew up a large, handsome flower, something like a tulip in appearance, but with its leaves tightly closed, as if it were still a bud. Well, it is a beautiful flower, said the woman, and she kissed the red and golden-coloured leaves, and while she did so, the flower opened, and she could see that it was a real tulip, and within the flower, upon the green velvet stamens, sat a very delicate and graceful little maiden. She was scarcely half as long as a thumb, and they gave her the name of Thumbelina, or Tiny, because she was so small. A walnut shell, elegantly polished, served her for a cradle. Her bed was formed of blue-violet leaves, with a rose leaf for a counterpane, and here she slept at night. But during the day she amused herself on a table, where the woman had placed a plateful of water, and around this plate were wreaths of flowers with their stems in the water, and upon it floated a large tulip leaf, which served Tiny for a boat. And here the little maiden sat and rowed herself from side to side with 2 oars made of white horsehair. Oh, it really was a very pretty sight. Tiny could also sing so softly and sweetly that nothing like her singing had ever been heard before. And one night, while she lay in her pretty bed, a large, ugly, wet toad crept through a broken pane of glass in the window and leapt right upon the table where Tiny lay sleeping under her rose-leaf quilt. "What a pretty little wife this will make for my son," said the toad, and she took up the walnut shell in which little Tiny lay asleep and jumped through the window with it into the garden. In the swampy margin of a broad stream in the garden lived the toad with her son. He was uglier even than his mother, and when he saw the pretty little maiden in her elegant bed, well, he could only cry, "Croak, croak, croak." "Oh, don't speak so loud, or she will wake," said the toad, "and then she might run away, for she is as light as swan's down. We will place her on one of the water lily leaves out in the stream. It will be like an island to her. She's so light and small, and then she cannot escape. And while she's away, we will make haste and prepare the stateroom under the marsh in which you are to live when you are married." Far out in the stream grew a number of water lilies with broad green leaves, which seemed to float on top of the water. The largest of these leaves appeared farther off than the rest, and the old toad swam out to it with the walnut shell in which lay Tiny, sleeping. Well, the tiny little creature woke very early in the morning and began to cry bitterly when she found out where she was, for she could see nothing but water on every side of the large green leaf, and there was no way of reaching land. Meanwhile, the old toad was very busy under the marsh, decking her room with rushes and wild yellow flowers to make it look pretty for her new daughter-in-law. Then she swam out with her ugly son to the leaf on which she'd placed poor little Tiny. She wanted to fetch the pretty bed, that she might put it in the bridal chamber to be ready for her. The old toad bowed low to her in the water and said, "Here is my son. He will be your husband, and you will live happily in the marsh by the stream." "Croak, croak, croak," was all her son could say for himself, and so the toad took up the elegant little bed and swam away with it, leaving Tiny all alone on the green leaf, where she sat and wept. She could not bear to think of living with the old toad and having her ugly son for a husband. The little fishes who swam about in the water beneath had seen the toad and heard what she said, and so they lifted their heads above the water to look at the little maiden. As soon as they caught sight of her, they saw she was very pretty, and it made them very sorry to think that she might go and live with the ugly toads. No, it must never be. So they assembled together in the water round the green stalk which held the leaf on which the little maiden stood, and they gnawed away at the root with their teeth, and then the leaf floated down the stream, carrying Tiny far away out of reach of the land. Tiny sailed past many towns, and the little birds in the bushes saw her, and they sang, "What a lovely little creature!" And so the leaf swam away with her farther and farther, till it brought her to other lands. A graceful little white butterfly constantly fluttered round her, and at last it lighted on the leaf, and Tiny pleased him, and she was glad of it, for now the toad could not possibly reach her, and the country through which she sailed was beautiful, and the sun shone upon the water till it glittered like liquid gold. She took off her belt and tied one end of it round the butterfly, and the other end of the ribbon she fastened to the leaf, which now glided on much faster than ever, taking little Tiny with it as she stood. Presently a large cockchafer flew by. Well, the moment he caught sight of her, he seized her round the delicate waist with his claws and flew with her into a tree. Oh, the green leaf floated away in the brook, and the butterfly flew with it, for he was fastened to it and could not get away. Oh, how frightened little Tiny felt when the cockchafer flew with her to the tree, but especially she was sorry for the beautiful white butterfly which she had fastened to the leaf, for if he could not free himself, he would die of hunger. But the cockchafer did not trouble himself at all about the matter. He seated himself by her side on a large green leaf, gave her some honey from the flowers to eat, and told her she was very pretty, though not in the least like a cockchafer. After a time, all the cockchafers turned up their feelers and said, "Well, she has only 2 legs. How ugly she looks." "Well, she has no feelers," said another. "Her waist is quite slim. Pooh, she's like a human being." "Oh, she is so ugly," said all the lady cockchafers, although Tiny was very pretty. And then the cockchafer who had run away with her believed all the others when they said she was ugly and would have nothing more to say to her, and told her that she might go where she liked. And then he flew down with her from the tree and placed her on a daisy. And she wept at the thought that she was so ugly that even the cockchafers would have nothing to do with her. And all the while she was really the loveliest creature that one could imagine, and as tender and delicate as a beautiful rose leaf. Well, during the whole summer, poor little Tiny lived quite alone in the wide forest. She wove herself a bed with blades of grass and hung it up under a broad leaf to protect herself from the rain. She sucked the honey from the flowers for food and drank the dew from their leaves every morning. And so passed away the summer and the autumn. And then came winter, the long, cold winter. All the birds who had sung to her so sweetly were flown away, and the trees and the flowers had withered. The large clover leaf under the shelter of which she had lived was now rolled together and shriveled up. Nothing remained but a yellow, withered stalk. She felt dreadfully cold, for her clothes were torn, and she was herself so frail and delicate that poor little Tiny was nearly frozen to death. And it began to snow, too, and the snowflakes, as they fell upon her, were like a whole shovelful falling upon us, for we're tall, but she was only an inch high. And then she wrapped herself up in a dry leaf, but it cracked in the middle and could not keep her warm, and she shivered with cold. Near the wood in which she had been living lay a cornfield, but the corn had been cut a long time. Nothing remained but the bare, dry stubble standing up out of the frozen ground. Well, it was to her like struggling through a large wood. Oh, how she shivered with the cold! She came at last to the door of a field mouse, who had a little den under the corn stubble. And there dwelt the field mouse in warmth and comfort, with a whole room full of corn, a kitchen, and a beautiful dining room. Well, poor little Tiny stood before the door just like a little beggar girl, and begged for a small piece of barley corn, for she'd been without a morsel to eat for 2 days. "Oh, you poor little creature," said the field mouse, who was really a good old field mouse. "Oh, come into my warm room and dine with me." Oh, she was very pleased with Tiny, so she said, "You're quite welcome to stay with me all the winter if you like, but you must keep my rooms clean and neat and tell me stories, for I shall like to hear them very much." And Tiny did all the field mouse asked her, and found herself very comfortable. "We shall have a visitor soon," said the field mouse one day. "My neighbor pays me a visit once a week. Well, he's better off than I am. He has large rooms and wears a beautiful black coat. Oh, if you could only have him for a husband, you'd be well provided for indeed. But he is blind, so you must tell him some of your prettiest stories." But Tiny did not feel at all interested about this neighbor, for he was a mole. And however he came and paid his visit dressed in a black velvet coat. "Oh, he's very rich and learned, and his house is 20 times larger than mine," said the field mouse. He was rich and learned, no doubt, but he always spoke slightingly of the sun and the pretty flowers, because he'd never seen them. Tiny was obliged to sing to him, Lady bird, fly away home," and many other pretty songs. And the mole fell in love with her because she had such a sweet voice. But he said nothing yet, for he was very cautious. A short time before, the mole had dug a long passage under the earth, which led from the dwelling of the field mouse to his own, and here she had permission to walk with Tiny whenever she liked. But he warned them not to be alarmed at the sight of a dead bird which lay in the passage. It was a perfect bird, with a beak and feathers, and could not have been dead long, and was lying just where the mole had made his passage. The mole took a piece of phosphorescent wood in his mouth, and it glittered like fire in the dark, and then he went before them to light the way through the long, dark passage. And when they came to the spot where lay the dead bird, the mole pushed his broad nose through the ceiling, and the earth gave way so that there was a large hole, and the daylight shone into the passage, and in the middle of the floor lay a dead swallow, his beautiful wings pulled close to his sides, his feet and his head drawn up under his feathers. Well, the poor bird had evidently died of the cold. It made little Tiny very sad to see it. She did so love the little birds. All the summer they had sung and twittered for her so beautifully. But the mole pushed it aside with his crooked legs and said, "Oh, he'll sing no more. How miserable it must be to be born a little bird. I'm thankful that none of my children will ever be birds, for they can do nothing but cry, tweet, tweet, and always die of hunger in the winter." "Yes, you may say that as a clever man," exclaimed the field mouse. "What is the use of his twittering, for When the winter comes, he must either starve or be frozen to death. Still, birds are very high-bred." Tiny said nothing, but when the two others had turned their backs on the bird, she stooped down and stroked aside the soft feathers which covered the head, and kissed the closed eyelids. "Perhaps this was the one who sang to me so sweetly this summer. Oh, and how much pleasure it gave me. And you dear, sweet bird." The mole now stopped up the hole through which the daylight shone, and then accompanied the lady home. But during the night, Tiny could not sleep, so she got out of bed and wove a large, beautiful carpet of hay, and then she carried it to the dead bird and spread it over him with some down from the flowers which she'd found in the field mouse's room. It was as soft as wool, and she spread some of it on each side of the bird, so that he might lie warmly in the cold earth. "Farewell, you pretty little bird," she said. "Farewell, and thank you for your delightful singing during the summer when all the trees were green and the warm sun shone upon us." And then she laid her head on the bird's breast. But she was alarmed immediately, for it seemed as if something inside the bird went thump, thump. Well, it was the bird's heart. He was not really dead, only benumbed with the cold, and the warmth had restored him to life. In autumn, when all the swallows fly away into warm countries, but if one happens to linger, well, the cold seizes it, it becomes frozen and falls down as if it's dead, and it remains where it fell, and the cold snow covers it. Tiny trembled very much. She was quite frightened, for the bird was large, a great deal larger than herself. She was only an inch high, but she took courage, and she laid the wool more thickly over the poor swallow, and then took a leaf which she had used for her own counterpane, and laid it over the head of the poor bird. The next morning she again stole out to see him. He was alive, but very weak. He could only open his eyes for a moment to look at Tiny, who stood by holding a piece of decayed wood in her hand, for she had no other lantern. "Thank you, pretty little maiden," said the sick swallow. "I've been so nicely warmed. I shall soon regain my strength and be able to fly about again in the warm sunshine." "Oh," said she, it's cold out of doors now. It snows and freezes. Stay in your warm bed. I will take care of you." Then she brought the swallow some water in a flower leaf, and after he had drank, he told her that he had wounded one of his wings in a thorn bush and could not fly as fast as the others, who were soon far away on their journey to warm countries. And so at last he had fallen to the earth, and could remember no more nor how he came to where she had found him. The whole winter the swallow remained underground, and Tiny nursed him with care and love. Neither the mole nor the field mouse knew anything about it, for they did not like swallows. Very soon springtime came, and the sun warmed the earth, and then the swallow bade Tiny farewell, and she opened the hole in the ceiling which the mole had made, and the sun shone in upon them so beautifully that the swallow asked her if she would go with him. Well, she could sit on his back, he said, and he would fly away with her into the green woods. But Tiny knew it would make the field mouse very grieved if she left her in that manner. So she said, "No, I cannot." "Oh, farewell, then. Farewell, you good, pretty little maiden," said the swallow, and he flew out into the sunshine. Tiny looked after him, and the tears rose in her eyes. She was very fond of the poor swallow. "Tweet, tweet," sang the bird as he flew out into the green woods, and Tiny felt very sad. She was not allowed to go out into the warm sunshine. The corn which had been sown in the field over the house of the field mouse had grown up high into the air and formed a thick wood to Tiny, who was only an inch in height. "You're going to be married, Tiny," said the field mouse. "My neighbors asked for you. What a good fortune for a poor child like you. Now we will prepare your wedding clothes. Well, they must be woolen and linen. Nothing must be wanting when you are the mole's wife." Tiny had to turn the spindle, and the field mouse hired 4 spiders who were to weave day and night. Every evening the mole visited her, and was continually speaking of the time when summer would be over, and then he would keep his wedding day with Tiny. But now the heat of the sun was so great that it burned the earth and made it quite hard, like a stone. As soon as the summer was over, the wedding should take place. But Tiny was not at all pleased, for she did not like the tiresome mole. Every morning when the sun rose and every evening when it went down, she would creep out the door, and as the wind blew aside the ears of corn, she could see the blue sky. And she thought how beautiful and bright it seemed out there, and wished so much to see the dear swallow again. But he never returned, for by this time he had flown far away into the lovely green forest. When autumn arrived, Tiny had her outfit quite ready, and the field mouse said to her, "In 4 weeks the wedding must take place." Then Tiny wept, and she said she would not marry the disagreeable mole. "What nonsense," replied the field mouse. "Now don't be obstinate, or I shall bite you with my white teeth. He's a very handsome mole. The queen herself does not wear more beautiful velvets and furs. His kitchen and cellars are quite full. You ought to be very thankful for such good fortune." So the wedding day was fixed, on which the mole was to fetch Tiny away to live with him deep under the earth and never again to see the warm sun, because he did not like it. The poor child was very unhappy at the thought of saying farewell to the beautiful sun, and as the field mouse had given her permission to stand at the door, she went to look at it once more. "Farewell, bright sun," she cried, stretching out her arms toward it, and then she walked a short distance down from the house where the corn had been cut, and only this dry stubble remained in the fields. "Farewell, farewell," she repeated, twining her arm round a little red flower that grew just by her side. "Greet the little swallow from me if you should see him again." "Oh, tweet, tweet," sounded over her head suddenly, where she looked up, and there was the swallow himself flying close by, and as soon as he spied Tiny, he was delighted. And then she told him how unwilling she felt to marry the ugly mole and to live always underneath the earth and never to see the bright sun any more. And as she told him, she wept. "Cold winter is coming," said the swallow, "and I'm going to fly away into warmer countries. Will you go with me? You can sit on my back and fasten yourself with your sash. Oh, then we can fly away from the ugly mole and his gloomy rooms, far away from the mountains into warmer countries where the sun shines more brightly than here and where it's always summer and the flowers bloom in greater beauty. Oh, fly now with me, dear little Tiny. You saved my life when I lay frozen in that dark passage." "Yes, I will go with you," said Tiny, and she seated herself on the bird's back with her feet on his outstretched wings and tied her belt to one of his strongest feathers. Then the swallow rose in the air and flew over forest and over sea, high above the highest mountains, covered with eternal snow. Tiny would have been frozen in the cold air, but she crept under the bird's warm feathers, keeping her little head uncovered so that she might admire the beautiful lands over which they passed. At length they reached the warm countries where the sun shines brightly and the sky seems so much higher than the earth. And here on the hedges and by the wayside grew purple and green and white grapes. Lemons and oranges hung from the trees in the woods, and the air was fragrant with myrtles and orange blossoms. Beautiful children ran along the country lanes, playing with large gay butterflies, and as the swallow flew farther and farther, every place appeared still more lovely. At last they came to a blue lake, and by the side of it, shaded by trees of the deepest green, stood a palace of dazzling white marble, built in the olden times. Vines clustered around its lofty pillars, and at the top were many swallows' nests, and one of these was the home of the swallow who carried Tiny. "This is my house," said the swallow, "but it would not do for you to live there. You'd not be comfortable. You must choose for yourself one of those lovely flowers, and I will put you down upon it, and you shall have everything that you can wish to make you happy." "That will be delightful," she said, and clapped her little hands for joy. A large marble pillar lay on the ground, which, in falling, had been broken into 3 pieces, and between these pieces grew the most beautiful large white flowers. So the swallow flew down with Tiny and placed her on one of the broad leaves. But how surprised she was to see in the middle of the flower a tiny little man, as white and transparent as if he'd been made of crystal. He had a gold crown on his head and delicate wings at his shoulders, and was not much larger than Tiny herself. He was the angel of the flower. For a tiny man and a tiny woman dwell in every flower, and this was the king of them all. Oh, how beautiful he is," whispered Tiny to the swallow. The little prince was at first quite frightened at the bird, who was like a giant compared to such a delicate little creature as himself. But when he saw Tiny, he was delighted and thought her the prettiest little maiden he'd ever seen. He took the gold crown from his head and placed it on hers, and asked her name, and if she would be his wife and queen over all the flowers. Well, this certainly was a very different sort of husband to the son of a toad or the mole with black velvet fur, so she said yes to the handsome prince, and then all the flowers opened, and out of each came a little lady or a tiny lord, and all so pretty. Well, it was quite a pleasure to look at them, and each of them brought Tiny a present. But the best gift was a pair of beautiful wings, which had belonged to a large white fly, and they fastened them to Tiny's shoulders, so that she might fly from flower to flower. Then there was much rejoicing, and the little swallow, who sat above them in his nest, was asked to sing a wedding song, which he did as well as he could, but in his heart he felt sad, for he was very fond of Tiny and would have liked never to part from her again. "You must not be called Tiny any more," said the spirit of the flowers to her. "It's an ugly name, and you're so very pretty. We will call you Maya." "Farewell, farewell," said the swallow with a heavy heart as he left the warm countries to fly back into Denmark. And there he had a nest over the window of a house in which dwelt the writer of fairy tales. The swallow sang, "Tweet, tweet," and from his song came the whole story. The end. Thumbelina, I know you're angry at me, but turn around. Look at me. Yes, Tom Cruise is your size, but I'm not going to introduce you to him because he's married and he has a child. And he, oh, Tom Thumb. Of course, I'll introduce you to Tom Thumb. Well, he's a wonderful man. You're all excited now, aren't you? Okay, well, you run home, get ready then. I'll call you when everything's set. Okay, bye-bye. Oh, hello. A few years ago, I was thinking of buying a new Ferrari sports car. So I packed my bags and I flew to Maranello, Italy, and the Ferrari headquarters to check out their new line of cars. The factory is wonderful. It's big and shiny, and they grow trees right inside the factory to help maintain the perfect humidity and air quality for building cars. Oh, they even have their own 2-mile racetrack, which you can take a new car on for a test drive. While I was looking around, I met another customer, a Mr. Flambe from Paris, France. He could not believe that I wanted to buy a Ferrari. "But a car this fast is not for the women," he said. "It is for men." I told him I disagreed, and I said that a woman could drive just as fast as a man. He pooh-poohed me and said, "Pooh-pooh." Well, one thing led to another, and an hour later, we were at the starting line of the racetrack, each sitting behind the wheel of a brand new Enzo Ferrari. Whoever made 3 laps around the track first would win $100. Mr. Flambe honked his horn, and we took off. In less than 10 seconds, I was already up to 120 miles per hour. Oh, the engines were roaring like thunder, and we were neck and neck. And that's when I discovered something scary. We were in such a hurry to start racing that I hadn't adjusted my seat properly. I was close enough to reach the gas pedal, but not close enough to reach the brakes. I stretched my foot and toes as far as I could, and I was still just an inch away. I suppose I should have just let the car coast to a stop and given up, but I couldn't stand the idea of Mr. Flambe winning, so I kept going, just zooming around the curves like lightning without ever touching the brake. Well, I beat Mr. Flambe by 6 seconds. "You are fearless, Mrs. P," he said. "Curves like this, like that. Oh, fearless." I just smiled, took my $100, and decided not to mention that the reason I was so fearless was that I was too darn short to reach the brakes. Now, this is an exciting story about someone else who never let the fact that he was too short stop him from getting what he wanted. It's the story of Tom Thumb. There was once a poor countryman who used to sit near the chimney all evening and poke the fire, while his wife sat at her spinning wheel. And he used to say, "How dull it is without any children about us. Our house is so quiet, and other people's houses are so noisy and merry." "Yes," answered his wife and sighed. "If we could only have children, or even just one, even a little one no bigger than my thumb, how happy I should be. It would indeed be having our heart's desire." Now it happened that after a while the woman had a child who was perfect in all his limbs, but no bigger than a thumb. And then the parents said, "He's just what we wished for, and we will love him very much." And they named him according to his stature, Tom Thumb. And though they gave him plenty of nourishment, he grew no bigger, but remained exactly the same size as when he was first born. And he was smart, and was very quick and prudent, so that all he did prospered. One day, his father made ready to go into the forest to cut wood, and he said, as if to himself, "Now I wish there was someone to bring the cart to meet me." "Oh, father," cried Tom Thumb, "I can bring the cart. Trust me alone for that, and in proper time, too." Then the father laughed and said, "Oh, how will you manage that? You're much too little to hold the reins." "Well, that has nothing to do with it, father. While my mother goes on with her spinning, I will sit in the horse's ear and tell him where to go." "Well," answered the father, "we will try it for once." When it was time to set off, the mother went on spinning. After setting Tom Thumb in the horse's ear, the father rode off on his own horse, crying, "Yep, go!" So the horse pulling the cart started up, and, with Tom in his ear, went right on quite as if his master were driving him, and drew the wagon along the right road to the wood. Now it happened, just as they turned a corner, and Tom Thumb was calling out, "Yep," that two strange men passed by. "Look," said one of them, "how's this? There goes a wagon, and the driver's calling to the horse, and yet he's nowhere to be seen." "Well, it's very strange," said the other. "We'll follow the wagon and see where it belongs." And the wagon went right through the wood up to the place where the wood had been hewed. When Tom Thumb caught sight of his father, he cried out, "Look, father, here I am with the wagon. Now take me down." The father held the horse with his left hand, and with the right hand he lifted his little son out of the horse's ear, and Tom Thumb sat down on a stump, quite happy and content. When the two strangers saw him, they were struck dumb with wonder. At last one of them, taking the other aside, said to him, "Look here, that little chap would make our fortune if we were to show him in town for money. Suppose we buy him." So they went up to the woodcutter and said, "Sell that little man to us. We'll take care of him. He'll come to no harm." "No," answered the father. "He is the apple of my eye, and not for all the money in the world would I sell him." But Tom Thumb, when he heard what was going on, climbed up to his father's coat-tails, and perching himself on his shoulder, he whispered in his ear, "Father, you might as well let me go. I will soon come back again." And then the father gave him up to the two men for a large piece of money. They asked him where he'd like to sit. "Oh, just put me on the brim of your hat," said he. "There I can walk about and view the country and be in no danger of falling off." So they did as he wished, and when Tom Thumb had taken leave of his father, they set off all together. And they travelled until it grew dark, and the little fellow asked to be set down a little while for a change, and after some difficulty they consented. So the man took him down from his hat and set him in a field by the roadside, and he ran away directly. and after creeping about among the furrows, he slipped suddenly into a mouse hole, just what he was looking for. "Good evening, my masters. You can go on without me," cried he to them, laughing. They ran up and felt about with their sticks in the mouse hole, but in vain. Tom Thumb crept farther and farther in, and as it was growing dark, they had to make the best of their way home, full of anger and empty purses. When Tom Thumb found that they were gone, he crept out of his hiding place underground. "Oh, it's dangerous work groping about these holes in the darkness," said he. "I might easily break my neck." But by good fortune he came upon an empty snail shell. "That's all right," said he. "Now I can get safely through the night." And he settled himself down in it. Before he had time to get to sleep, he heard two men pass by, and one was saying to the other, "How can we manage to get hold of the rich parson's gold and silver?" "I can tell you how," cried Tom Thumb. "How is this?" said one of the thieves, quite frightened. "I hear someone speak." So they stood still and listened, and Tom Thumb spoke again. "Take me with you. I will show you how to do it." "Where are you then?" asked they. "Look about on the ground and notice where the voice comes from," answered he. At last they found him and lifted him up. "You little elf," said they, "how can you help us?" "Look here," answered he. "I could creep easily between the iron bars of the parson's room and hand out to you whatever you'd like to have." "Very well," said they. "We will see what you can do." So when they came to the parson's house, Tom Thumb crept into the room, but cried out with all his might, "Will you have all that is here?" So the thieves were terrified and said, "Do speak more softly, lest anyone should be awaked." But Tom Thumb made as if he did not hear them, and cried out again, "What would you like? Will you have all that's here?" So that the cook, who was sleeping in a room nearby, heard it, and raised herself in bed, and listened. The thieves, however, in their fear of being discovered, had run back part of the way, but they took courage again, thinking that it was only a jest of the little fellows. So they came back and whispered to him to be serious and to hand them out something. Then Tom Thumb called out once more, as loud as he could, "Oh, yes, I will give it all to you, only put out your hands." Then the listening maid heard him distinctly that time, and jumped out of bed and burst open the door, and the thieves ran off as if the wild huntsmen were behind them. But the maid, as she could see nothing, went to fetch a light, and when she came back with one, Tom Thumb had taken himself off without being seen by her and into the barn. And the maid, when she had looked in every hole and corner, found nothing, and went back to bed at last, and thought that she must have been dreaming with her eyes and ears open. So Tom Thumb crept among the hay and found a comfortable nook to sleep in, where he intended to remain until it was day, and then to go home to his father and mother. But other things were to befall him. Indeed, there is nothing but trouble to worry about in the world. The maid got up at dawn to feed the cows. The first place she went was the barn, where she took up an armful of hay, and it happened to be the very heap in which Tom Thumb lay asleep. And he was so fast asleep that he was aware of nothing and never waked until he was in the mouth of the cow who had taken him up with the hay. "Oh dear," cried he, "how is it that I've got into a mill?" But soon he found out where he was, and he had to be very careful not to get between the cow's teeth. And at last he had to descend into the cow's stomach. "Oh, the windows were forgotten when this little room was built," said he, "and the sunshine cannot get in. There's no light to be had." His quarters were in every way unpleasant to him, and what was the worst, new hay was constantly coming in, and the space was being filled up. At last he cried out as loud as he could, "No more hay for me! No more hay for me!" The maid was milking the cow, and as she heard a voice, but couldn't see no one, it was as if the same voice that she'd heard in the night. Well, she was so frightened that she fell off her stool and spilt the milk. And then she ran in great haste to her master, crying, "Oh, master dear, the cow spoke." "Well, you must be crazy," answered her master, and he went himself to the cow house to see what was the matter. No sooner had he put his foot inside the door than Tom Thumb cried out again, "No more hay for me! No more hay for me!" Then the parson himself was frightened, supposing that a bad spirit had entered into the cow, and he ordered her to be put to death, and so she was killed. But the stomach, where Tom Thumb was lying, was thrown upon a dunghill, Tom Thumb had great trouble to work his way out of it, and he had just made a space big enough for his head to go through when a new misfortune happened. A hungry wolf ran up and swallowed the whole stomach at one gulp. But Tom Thumb did not lose courage. Perhaps, thought he, the wolf would listen to reason. And he cried out from inside the wolf, "My dear wolf, I can tell you where there's a splendid meal." "Where's it to be had?" asked the wolf. "In such and such a house, and you must creep into it through the drain, and there you'll find cakes and bacon and broth, well, as much as you can eat." And he described to him his father's house. The wolf needed to not be told twice. He squeezed himself through the drain in the night and feasted in the pantry to his heart's content. When at last he was satisfied, he wanted to go away again, but he had become so big that to creep the same way back out was impossible. This Tom Thumb had reckoned on, and began to make a terrible din inside the wolf, crying and calling as loud as he could. "Would you be quiet?" said the wolf. "You will wake the owners up." "Look here," cried the little man. "You're all very well satisfied, and now I'll do something for my own enjoyment." And he began again to make all the noise he could. At last the father and mother were awakened, and they ran to the room door and peeped through the chink, and when they saw a wolf in occupation, they ran and fetched weapons, the man an axe, and the wife a butcher knife. "Stay behind," said the man as they entered the room. "When I've given him a blow, and it does not seem to have killed him, well, then you must cut at him with your knife." Then Tom Thumb heard his father's voice and cried, "Dear father, I am here inside the wolf." And then the father called out full of joy, "Thank heaven that we found our dear child," and told his wife to keep the knife out of the way, lest Tom Thumb should be hurt with it. And then he drew near and struck the wolf such a blow on the head that it fell down dead. And then he fetched the knife and a pair of scissors and slit open the wolf's body and let out the little fellow. "Oh, we have been so worried about you," said the father. "Yes, father, I've seen a good deal of the world, and I'm very glad to breathe fresh air again." "And where have you been all this time?" asked his father. "Oh, I've been in a mouse hole and a snail shell, in a cow's stomach and a wolf's inside, and now I think I will stay at home." "And we will not part with you for all the kingdoms of the world," cried his parents, as they kissed and hugged their dear little Tom Thumb, and they gave him something to eat and drink and a new suit of clothes, as his old ones were torn and dirty from his many adventures. The end.